Welcome to our Harmonyus podcast series. My name is Michael Francis Lott, and I am here with author Peter Wells, who is the author of the book Notes from the West Pole. And today we're going to be diving into his piece called The Intelligence.
I've been talking about a change of consciousness. What is this change of consciousness? The change we're going through, which is an evolutionary change, is also based on the structure of our social order and the way that we are required to conform to it. The old power of the king was absolute over everyone in his nation. And now, in the nation, there's absolute power, usually in the government, but sometimes in a dictator or in an authoritarian regime. The power is meted down on all of the people inside the sovereign nation. So we have an authoritarian, tyrannical kind of situation all around the world. Every single government insists on absolute power over all of its citizens. So every person who grows up in this world, who receives the education, the training, is receiving this idea that they are required to be obedient to this outside power, this authority. It can be called king, it can be called president, it can be called God, but it's a power outside of the self. So we have been living according to this power for centuries. And we now have a world of nation states in which the only power that any one of these nation states will honor is their own. So we have people like Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin who are thinking that they embody the nation and they have power over the whole population. So this understanding that we're all trained to accept, this understanding that the power is outside of us, this understanding that we are just little beings of no great consequence, that we have to be obedient to this outside power and conform to the requirements. Well, the thing that's changing is this very thing. What's happening is we are now waking up to the realization that the power is not outside of ourselves. The power is actually within us. It's not on a throne. It's not up in the sky. It's actually deeply within our own being. We are rooted in this universe, and the intelligence that brought us here, that is still with us, is the intelligence of the universe. What else could it be? So now this transition from being obedient to a power outside of ourselves to fulfilling the actual power within, that transition is what we are now engaged in. And the idea that we now are feeling, it's all within the person, it's all within the consciousness. And that is that we want to fulfill this life we're living. We want to be this energy, this love, this person to its fullest extent, and to be awake and alive on this planet and contributing our energy to something that works. We want a more harmonious way of life than we've inherited. The idea that we have been ruled and dominated and forced into wars and conflicts, that idea is now past. We no longer want to do that. We now want to live harmoniously in our own world, in our own space, interdependent with others, and in love with the life being lived, but not feeling dominated, not feeling enslaved by an antiquated social order. So we awaken now. We go forward now with our own individual being in charge of this life. We're not subject to anything else. We are ruled by the intelligence within us.
Wow. So thank you, Peter, for that beautiful piece there. I feel like what you're hitting on here is a huge universal predicament that we're all just facing, well, obviously within our culture, but also individually. And I've noticed, in my own path, going through my own development, one of the biggest things that I've struggled with is that I feel like I've sort of created this false self to relate to this outside power. And for so much of my life, that is what I have related to and thought of to be myself. And so making that transition to trust and to validate the inner self, that's really stepping into the unknown, really going into unknown territory there.
Right. Well, if the authority is false, then the identity that you create to relate to that authority is false. And we've been brought up with false authorities. And finding our true self, our true nature, is not easy.
Right.
We grow up with parents who have themselves been indoctrinated to a belief system in which there are many outside authorities and powers that have to be dealt with. And how do we get to the silence that allows our own being to be itself? That's the question. We talked earlier, I think, about the inner journey, about getting to a point in our lives where we have to undo or at least diminish our conditioning and find our own voice, our own self. What is this thing? Where am I? What's going on? What can I actually believe in? What can I work on to move myself into a comfortable position in this universe, in this society? I take that back about the universe. There's nothing wrong about the universe, but our society is so divided by positive and negative teachings about what's wrong and what's right, about good and evil. All of that stuff is in our way. We don't need to judge ourselves as good or evil. We are what we are, no matter what we judge it.
Right. Yeah, and the way that I kind of see it is, so you're talking about that there's this aspect of the self that is composed of all these judgments, right? And so many people go about their lives based off of what they should or shouldn't do, as opposed to this external authority. And so, like we said before, we develop this sort of false self. So when the human being goes through this process of conditioning or becoming socialized, this self becomes split into two primary components. And you have this one aspect that is the conditioned self, and then this other aspect that we could call the soul. And the way that I see these two aspects relating to each other is very similar to that of a caterpillar in its cocoon, where the soul sort of creates, in my perspective, this sort of cocoon, and then within it has this very deep transformative experience, and then it gets to a place in its development where it just begins to break out. And then it slowly strengthens its wings, and it flies out in the world.
Isn't that
as
marvelous?
A beautiful butterfly.
Yeah, I love it.
So that's sort of how I see this process. So one of the biggest things that's standing out to me is this: how we create this false self that relates to this authority, and for me, and I've noticed in my process, I've gotten so uncomfortable in that false self that I had to completely find a way to break out, So.
Yeah, well, it's to our advantage. We go to school, and the teacher is an authority, and they insist on having quiet and having obedience, and it makes total sense that we would obey that.
Right.
We don't have the strength to deny it, actually.
Right.
But so the question is, what voice do we listen to? And if we listen to our own voice, and that's a conditioned voice that has been learned from different religions or different philosophies, we're not really engaged with the wholeness of ourselves.
Right.
So we have to find a way to be whole within this paraphernalia of division and alienation. And the only way we can do that, really, it seems, is to separate ourselves from the society and actually allow the natural being that we are to hear this source within us, this absolute truth. Because our mind is not the real source.
Right.
It's the intelligence of the whole being is both where we come from and where we're going. And if we're going to make a difference to our society, which is in a great deal of difficulty, then we have to be real and whole and in the truth ourselves, of ourselves. Then we can do something. If we're still affirming and denying these so-called teachings, we're just lost in this labyrinth of duality. So the whole thing of the intelligence that we're talking about is the wholeness, and it is the intelligence of the soul that unifies both the conscious and the unconscious, that accepts itself as a total entity and lives from its own center. It's not, the army, you're in the army, you have to be obedient, or you either get shot or imprisoned or something. And generally, we're accustomed to being obedient to the culture, but the culture is not doing well. So we have to find a way to be effective in the culture by being truly who we are, by using this intelligence that has come to us naturally. The intelligence is whole. The society is divided and divisive. We have friends and enemies, we have good and evil, and these are formed in us at a very early age. Now what we have to do is be the whole being and be the whole planet, the whole human family, and let our own intelligence, the intelligence of the universe, what else could it be, letting the intelligence of the universe come through us and be itself.
Right. Yeah. And so everything that you're speaking about, it's something that I consciously try to implement on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that I sort of have come to in this is I find myself oscillating a lot between those identities, between the conditioned self and between the soul. And there's moments when I'm out, by the ocean and I'm writing in my journal and I feel completely at one with the world around me and the flowers and everything. And it's like, yeah, okay, this is reality. I'm in touch with myself in this moment, and then I'll shift and I'll go and I'll start to engage with people, and even just going to the grocery store starts to bring up certain judgments and so on and so forth. And then it's like, okay, now I'm back to this old sort of sense of identity. And I'm wondering, you having been through this process yourself, if you still find yourself oscillating between these two things, or is there a certain tipping point where you feel like you're more on a day-to-day practical level identified with who you are, on a soul level?
We have to accept the whole thing. So I have to accept all of my experience throughout my whole life and be undivided about it. There's nothing wrong with what we were taught. It's whether or not we need to use it in the direction that we're going. We're going in a direction of actually changing the culture. We're going through the as the piece says, we're going from being dominated and from being ordered around to being awake and free with this intelligence. The freedom can only be felt if the whole self is accepted. That includes the conditioned parts of our being. Our identity has gone through everything that comprises what we are. We can't deny any part of that if we want to be whole.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things too that comes to me is, okay, so in order to get in touch with the wholeness of who we are, we have to completely accept ourselves, in every single aspect of of who we are. And when I go very deeply into my inner journey, I can do that, and I find a lot of emotion. I find a lot of rage and a lot of anger and a lot of emotions that would be completely unacceptable.
Who do you feel
culture.
the rage against, or how do you demonstrate that to yourself?
How do I demonstrate that?
Yeah.
Well, first I acknowledge it, and I acknowledge that it's there, and then I might write about it in my journal, or I might go out into the forest and
Right.
like a madman, and release it. And so there's a degree of acceptance I have in myself. But then when I have those experiences of deeply accepting myself, there's this thought that comes to me, and it's like, wow, if I was to go out and demonstrate this in public, or if anyone else saw this aspect of me, then I would probably be rejected or cast aside as like a loony or something. You know what I mean?
I wouldn't do it.
Well, I know you wouldn't.
Yeah.
But like if my parents saw me act like that, they would want to send me to a mental institution or something like that. Or if I went out and, I don't know, did it on the street, So I don't know. I'm still exploring what that means to truly accept oneself, and then how to take that acceptance and integrate that into...
Well, I think you have to find, in order to, I think we all do it. We all rebel against so-called false authority. It's natural for the teenager to say, hey, that's screwed. I'm not going to go for that. Or even at any other age, too. But so we have to fully look at our predicament. Then in that, there's a, as you say, the soul. There's this intelligence that is at rest within us. And if we really listen to that and undo the teachings, let the teachings occupy a lesser place in the being, and let the person who is negotiating this life, who's trying to find a way through it to be happy and peaceful and harmonious, that person has to do that work to find it, but cannot actually deny what exists in order to do that. The denial gets in the way. It becomes an interruption to the flow of the being. The flow of the being has gone through this excruciating education. Maybe it's not excruciating for everybody.
It was excruciating for me.
Yeah, me too. Has to come out of that into the wholeness of the self that includes all of it, but it particularly includes this amazing intelligence that we are, that is beyond our thinking. It's beyond our ability to believe or cogitate. It just simply is. So in being that, we have come to a more comprehensive place than the belief systems that have taught us have advocated, Original sin, for example. How weird is that?
Yeah.
That we have a child learning that there is a sin in them already, and that it has to be dealt with. They have to repress this and that. Any kind of repression clutters the being.
Right. Yeah, and that whole notion of original sin, that just shows how far back this goes, of these authorities really making sure that people do not trust their own true nature,
right.
Because that was a way for them to maintain power, and it's
exactly.
Like, you are inherently flawed at the core of who you are, so you can't trust yourself, so give your power to us.
Give your power to the church.
And even though, the whole notion of original sin, maybe in some Christian churches that's still really popular, but amongst our society, that's still a deep psychological wound that so many people are struggling with.
Right.
It's this really deep-rooted sense of shame, of believing that there's something wrong with you at the core of who you are.
Right.
Therefore, you can't actually trust yourself.
Inadequacy.
Right.
Inability to be a whole, upstanding individual because you're carrying this fundamental blemish.
So how did you, because it's a universal theme, so how did you work with that?
I never accepted it.
You never
as a kid. No.
Did you feel like you had that sort of psychological wound, or you just completely rejected it?
No,
It
I
never really
completely
stuck with
reject.
you?
I never accepted it.
Huh.
I don't know why. Maybe there wasn't a strong religious leadership in my family, like Christianity.
Right.
Or also, the other thing is that a lot of my teachers, they had just come back from a war where they had been killing people or being subject to, their death. And so they were traumatized. Mm-hmm. And so they're saying this, and this, and you go, wow, hey man, you're kind of nuts. And I'm not going there,
Yeah.
But you have to deal with them, you have to accept them. And that's life. It's kind of, in our world, we have a governmental structure that is the rule of law, mm-hmm. that says that you are being ruled, and the intelligence of the being is disempowered. Mm-hmm. And we're in an evolving condition that is, I think, in the process of overthrowing the outside power and bringing to life the full inner whole being, mm-hmm. that has this whole universal soul connection. Mm. If we can take that as our guide, if we can say, okay, I am the whole of this, I'm unconscious, I know nothing about what's going on with my digestive system, neither I nor science knows what's going on in my brain, and yet I'm actually living it. I am actually this brain. Mm-hmm. I'm living in the unknown. And that unknown is marvelous, is beyond any judgment or evaluation.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like people, as a whole, they're really afraid to trust that, to trust that inner knowing, that inner self, because our whole life, every teacher, every growing up has taught us that we can't, and that's
You're forbidden.
Yeah, forbidden, and it's incredible because that's actually the seat of our power, and that's what all the great teachers and artists and mystics of this world, that was what they demonstrated, and that was their demonstration was a true testament to that power.
Right.
That was the real message to humanity, Christ and Gandhi and these incredible beings that walk this world. So.
Right. And there is a tendency, of course, to turn their behavior and their ideas into a religion, I mean, that, and then what happens, it becomes, look what happened with Paul, mm-hmm. Paul of Tarsus. He became a Christian on the road to Damascus when he met Stephen. And in doing that, he conceived of a religion. But his concept of the religion was resist evil. Fight against your enemy and resist evil. Mm-hmm. Whereas Jesus himself said, or Matthew did for him, repeating, he said, resist ye not evil. Mm-hmm. And so the division in Christianity of what is to be desired and what is to be rejected messes us up, puts us into a position of rejecting a part of ourselves.
Oh yeah, it completely goes against the original teachings of Christ.
Exactly.
If you look deep enough into the Gnostic teachings, that's exactly what he was saying.
Right.
That everything is sacred, every aspect of ourselves, radical acceptance.
Right.
Of the self.
We happen to be living at a time of enormous change, and the change is actually happening within us. And as you point out, in your day, whether you go to the grocery store or out to the headlands, you're dealing with a very complex self that is you. Mm-hmm. Because that complex self has had this training and this conditioning and these belief systems, and yet you're in the process of being without that kind of power or without that power over you. Mm-hmm. So as we evolve into this new acceptance of ourselves, it's not new, it's ancient, but into this acceptance of ourselves and really empowering ourselves, not empowering some military expedition or a religion that is being thrust on us. Our whole quest is to be this intelligence, to accept it, to live it, and to not. It's not a conflict. There's no conflict in it. There's no conflict in being in the soul consciousness. Soul consciousness is not with conflict because it's whole. Our existence is filled with conflict all over the place, but not who we actually are. So the conflicted ideas need to take a lesser place in the consciousness and to allow us to move forward into the freedom that we naturally have. It's who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Boy, it's very good to talk with you.
Yeah.
Every time, once a week like this.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to the next one, as well as having enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Have a good week, everybody. We'll see you next time. Stay connected with us and get the book Notes from the West Pole on our website, www.harmonius.com. And that's spelled Harmony Us with a Y. Thanks for listening.